Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Take. My name is Alan. If you're a Sith Lord, how do you get control over the natural resources of a people who are proud and independent and don't want anything to do with you? Well, if it's the old Republic period, you would just send your army there and forcefully occupy their lands. But this most likely will fuel an insurgency, create political unrest, plus your own people will kind of see like an asshole which you'll have to suppress, and then there's just going to be way too many resources invested in getting more resources. But if you're smart, you pull a Palpatine, you orchestrate a completely fake war with a fake separatist alliance and use those separatists to threaten specific worlds you might have an eye on, which then allows you to send your own forces to to defend those planets, and, well, after the separatists are defeated, who says you have to leave, right? I mean, this was a sly strategy that was used by Palpatine to gain control of dozens upon dozens of worlds without actually looking like an aggressor. It was pure genius. For instance, you have planets like Ryloth, home to the Twilight people who were rugged and proud. I mean, yeah, they oftentimes did become slaves, and that was because they had a weak central government that wasn't able to protect them, but it wasn't easy to control this planet, and never was easy. Well, Ryloth was invaded in the initial moments of the Clone Wars, and legions of clones would bleed and give their lives alongside with their Jedi commanders for the Twi'lek's freedom. I mean, you guys know Chancellor Palpatine and the Twi'lek resistance. They didn't trust anyone. They didn't trust their own fat, bloated senator back on Coruscant. They definitely were going to trust a bunch of outsiders and their clone troopers. But 4 years of fighting created real connections between the clone forces and the Twi'lek people, something that the Empire and Vice Admiral Rampart would manipulate and use to his advantage. As predicted, the clone army would never leave after the Clone Wars ended. The post-war occupation became permanent. And not even Chancellor Palpatine saw this coming. For the longest time, he tried to get his people to go alongside with the Empire, something that a lot of people don't talk about. Now, eventually, individuals like Chancellor Palpatine and Captain Hauser would be removed from the equation, and the planet would turn into a cheap source for labor and spice. And it would take the Free Ryloth movement decades to push the Empire off their planet. They already had garrisons all over the place, factories, all sorts of infrastructure already created. There was no invasion needed at all. But as I mentioned, Ryloth was a target pretty early on in the Clone Wars. It was a legitimate target for the Separatists to basically go after, since it was kind of on the border of Hutt space and the Outer Rim and had no real power center controlling it. But if you take a closer look at the last year and last moments of the Clone Wars during what is known as the Outer Rim Siege. Now, in the last few minutes of the Clone Wars, the Republic would carry out several very, suspicious invasions. And I believe these invasions were specifically done to take over land, or at least get clone trooper boots on the ground for the transition to the Empire. Our first example is the Siege of Mandalore. The Mandalorians were always going to be a problem for any major power in the galaxy, and that's because of their martial culture. Whichever side gets the Mandalorians on their side has a huge military advantage. But the Clone Wars was hardly a war between the Republic and the Separatists. Both factions were controlled by the Sith, and the entire purpose of the conflict was to expand the war further. Therefore, the only enemy that the Sith had during this entire event were those who were opposed to the Clone Wars. And for some reason, just during that specific time period, Mandalore, for the first time in its history, introduced a new political ideology called the New Mandalorians, and they were actually pacifists, and they would create what was known as the Council of Neutral Systems. Duch Osetia Kryze was focused more on building up the economy and society rather than engaging in another long-term conflict. And as the head of the Council of Neutral Systems, he really pissed off both the Republic and the Separatists, and of course, the Sith Lords. Neutrality is a luxury, and it needs to be backed up by some type of muscle or military power, and unfortunately the New Mandalorians were not really focused on building up Mandalore's standing army, and so they were susceptible to all sorts of outside influence. The Sith would encourage the extremist organization known as Death Watch to undermine the rule of Osetia Kryze. Death Watch would ally with the former assassin known as Maul, who would bring with him a coalition of criminal scum. Together, this ragtag army of extremists and gang members would overwhelm Mandalore and take it over. Now, Emperor Palpatine was Maul's old master, and he would actually come and visit Maul after he took the planet. You would think this would be the perfect opportunity for Maul to swear allegiance once again to Palpatine and turn over Mandalore to the future Empire. Now, Palpatine was impressed that Maul had survived his ordeal on Naboo, but he was also furious that his former apprentice had selected an apprentice of his own, Savage Opress. This was a direct threat to Palpatine's power as a Sith Lord. And so Palpatine absolutely ragdolls the Dathomiri brothers and leaves soon after that. What he doesn't do is take over Mandalore at that moment by, placing his own puppet in charge. But then literally in the last day of the war, the Republic finally approved an invasion of Mandalore, which would lead to the famous Siege of Mandalore. Bo-Katan Kryze had been trying to retake the world ever since Maul had taken it over. It seems like a coincidence that she finally got the support she needed just hours before Order 66 would kick off. So what does Mandalore have that the Empire really needs? Well, a few important things. The martial spirit of the Mandalorian people made them excellent shock troopers, or at least those who were willing to obey, that is. There are also some great weapons designers who hailed from Mandalore, like Sabine Wren. She would create an energy weapon capable of tuning into special metals and plastics. And then lastly, there was the large deposits of Beskar that could be found on the planet. This was an incredibly durable metal that was capable of stopping all sorts of energy projectiles. I do think that the invasion of Mandalore was purposely carried out before the Clone Wars actually ended. This was in order to allow the Empire to establish a presence on the planet without actually having to invade it much later on, which of course would have taken a lot more resources because these are Mandalorians. And as we see during the Mandalorian series, the Empire is still there many years after its collapse. The importance of this planet cannot be understated. The Wookiees were a strong and proud species who lived on the rich and abundant world of Sheik. Legends say that in ancient times, an alien race terraformed Sheik in order to make it into an agricultural world. This is why the trees on the planet can grow several miles into the air. Planets rich in fauna also have rich deposits of fossil fuels beneath the surface, adding to the long list of natural resources that can be extracted from this world. This planet also happened to be on a very important junction of the hyperspace lanes and sat in between the outer rim and the core. And so it was really a no-brainer for the Separatists to target this world, and the Republic were fully aware of that as well. This is probably why no major incursion on the planet occurred during the Clone Wars until the Outer Rim Siege period. The Outer Rim Siege was very much the last stage of the Clone Wars. By this point, an escalation in military production and funding allowed the Republic to finally push the Separatists back to the Outer Rim. The Republic now had besieged many Separatist worlds from Megiddo to Cato Nemoidia. Separatist forces were now held up and mostly fighting desperate defensive actions, and so no one really expected General Grievous to engage the Republic in a series of counter-offensive actions. It was sort of like the last-ditch Ardennes offensive the Germans carried out in the winter of 1944. This counter-offensive would reach everywhere across the galaxy, including even Coruscant itself. The move was designed to relieve pressure on the Outer Rim strongholds of the Separatists and cause multiple dilemmas for the Jedi and Republic on where they should deploy or redeploy their troops. And so in the last year of the war, the Separatist Alliance would invade Sheik. They would blockade the planet and set up slave camps and also resource production camps all over the planet. Thanks to the terrain of Sheik and its ferocious native inhabitants, the Separatist operation would immediately encounter setbacks. Eventually, the Republic would respond as well, and they would send a fleet with Jedi Master Yoda and Luminara Unduli in charge. And so just days before Order 66 is carried out, not only is Master Yoda conveniently surrounded by clones, he's also thousands of light years away from the Jedi Temple. Now Master Yoda would be surrounded by a bunch of clone troopers who would eventually turn into Imperial troopers. So not only was Palpatine going to get a free shot to kill Yoda without actually having to fight him, he was also getting another prime piece of real estate that would surely benefit the Empire's industrial efforts later on. If there's one thing that I've learned about Palpatine, especially during this period of time when he's in charge of the Republic, it's that he has a plan for everything. Nothing just happens by accident. Planets like Sheik and Mandalore would become an important part of the Empire's growing military-industrial complex. Palpatine would also add other worlds to his collection, like Ryloth, as we mentioned, and Mbaum. The world of Felucia was home to some of the worst fighting in the Clone Wars, and now securely in Imperial hands, along with its many rare medicinal herbs. General Grievous would also launch an attack on Onderon in the waning moments of the Clone Wars. This planet already had its own ongoing civil war, which only complicated the situation even more. Onderon would become an extremely important part of the Empire in that region of space. It would be a place where munitions would be made. It's thanks to this quick thinking that the Empire never really had to carry out a full-on invasion of a planet, which would have been a terribly resource-intensive operation. So there you have it, guys. A lot of people focus on Order 66 and how, Palpatine grabbed a lot of power from himself, but I think, pre-positioning clone troopers that would turn into Imperial troopers on worlds that he already wanted, especially in that last-minute grab, is a genius move. And I think we can recognize that Palpatine, especially during the Republic era where he still had checks and balances against him, was functioning at peak condition. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy.